Welcome, everybody. My name is Sydney Weber. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communication for OhioHealth Oblenis Hospital, and we're really excited for tonight's Southeast Ohio History program celebrating Oblenis Hospital's 100 years. Before we get started, I wanted to do a little housekeeping. I'm here in the OhioHealth Studio, and we have Tom O'Grady remotely and Dr. Gary Cordingley remotely. We also have Mark Seckinger and Rick Castro, who can join us remotely as well. I'd like to call your attention to the little chat button. If you actually join Vimeo, it will ask you. You have access to chat. You can put comments in. You can ask questions. I'll be monitoring the chat during the program, and at the end, we'll try to answer all the questions. And if relevant, maybe we can ask one of the speakers during the presentation to answer a question. So anyways, I look forward to the program. I hope you do too, and I'm going to turn this over to Tom O'Grady.
Thank you, Sydney, and thanks, Mark and Rick, for joining us this evening, and thanks to everyone out there who's tuning in tonight to hear this talk. Sydney reached out to the History Center several months ago to talk about a collaboration between the Southeast Ohio History Center and Oblenis Hospital as they were approaching the celebration of the 100th anniversary of this institution. And they want to be sure to really be thoughtful about the role of the hospital in the community and to honor the past. At a time in history when healthcare, health emergencies from natural and human disasters, and a pandemic play such a large role in our daily lives, it's important that we think more about how our healthcare services came about and the changing roles such facilities have played and the challenges they face over time so that we can improve the care and the facilities needed in the years to come. Our past always informs the present and is invaluable to our future. My colleague Jessica acquired many boxes full of photos and documents of historical interest from the hospital. They have been well cared for over the years, probably passing through many sets of hands. The fact that there was such a great archive speaks volumes about the importance of history to those individuals who preserved it. Jessica then added what was donated to the History Center over the years, a large collection, and shared some of those items with the hospital as they planned this celebration and their exhibit. It's been wonderful. It's been a wonderful collaboration, and we're glad to be part of this milestone for Oblenis. Tonight, we are pleased to have Dr. Cordingley with us to bring this history to life. Dr. Gary Cordingley is the author of Stories of Medicine in Athens County, Ohio, a county medical history book that features diverse stories from area doctors, nurses, administrators, patients, historians, media, and other sources. Dr. Cordingley practiced neurology in Athens, Ohio for 30 years, and taught this subject at Ohio University Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine for 37 years. Currently, he serves as the medical director at Health Recovery Services, an addiction agency. Dr. Cordingley's articles on neurology, neuroscience, and medical history have appeared in numerous professional and general publications. Dr. Cordingley graduated from Purdue University with a BS in chemistry and biology and attended Duke University where he earned a PhD in physiology and pharmacology, as well as an MD. He received his internship training at the University of Michigan Hospitals, residency training at the Neurological Institute of Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, New York, and fellowship training as a pharmacology research associate in the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. I give you Dr. Gary Cordingley. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom and Sydney. I appreciate the invitation as well as the chance to tell the stories. So welcome this evening to what I hope will be an entertaining and informative rapid journey through 100 years of history. I have to let you know that there's lightning and thunder outside my window. There's some things outside my control, so I'm just going to go through and we'll just hope for the best, okay? All right, so so to make life interesting, the slide is not advancing, so let's see what we can do. There we go. So my first comments are for a request for forgiveness for my sins of omission and commission. I really would like to mention everybody, but I'm not going to. But we know everybody contributed, and I am going to screw up, and so I apologize for that. It's all on me, okay? I've had a lot of help from dozens of people over the years in compiling these stories, but here in this end, last 100 yards here, I've had a lot of help from Lynn Anastos, Rick Castro, Joy Miller-Upton, Mark Seckinger, and Keely Stockwell, whom I'd like to particularly thank. All right. Well, let's go back to 1888, before there was a sheltering arms or a Blennis Hospital. Here's Athens County, and here is a map of the county dated 1888. I did find a directory that showed where all the doctors were in Athens County 2 years later in 1890. I'm going to put a little cross where they all are. Okay? So there they are, scattered all over the place. There's 6 around Athens. There's 7 around Nelsonville, and make that 8 if you count Buckle. Nelsonville was a larger town at the end of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. They had their bricks and their coal. And Athens just had a small population university. Things did change over time. But that, even those 2 together were not the majority of locations where the doctors were scattered, okay? In fact, I tallied it for you. So from the directory of 1890, there was a total of 28 physicians I found. If you add Athens and Nelsonville together, I guess minus Buckle, it's 12, 16 elsewhere. Less than half, fewer than half, were located in the 2 cities of Athens and Nelsonville. But now, going on to 2001, helped by the Verizon phone directory, Athens and Nelsonville are now 59, and just 5 elsewhere, 3 in Coolville, 1 Albany, 1 Gloucester, and now 92% of the physicians are located in those 2 cities. So what happened? Okay. Why was there such a convergence of doctors on just 2 cities in the county? Another way you could ask it is, why was there such a divergence, scattering of physicians to start with? And there's some straightforward answers to that. One is roads. They were terrible, gradually improved. Vehicles, and we're talking about horses to start with, back in 1888 and 1890. And even the earliest motorized vehicles had to contend with those really rotten roads. So it was really hard for people to move around. And then another reason for convergence is now hospitals. Why do we care about hospitals? Why would that draw people in, including the doctors who take care of the patients? Well, now you have inpatient care with nurses. You have diagnostic equipment, blood tests, urine tests, x-rays, surgical facilities, and increasingly specialist care. I want to tell you that I consider one of the very first medical specialties in the US in general, and Athens County, is nursing. You think with doctors and nurses, that's sort of a natural 1-2 pairing, you know, like peanut butter and jelly or whatever. But it wasn't always so. You look back at the Civil War, and doctors were out there in some difficult situations, sawing off portions of legs and other limbs and doing what they could to patch the soldiers together. And then there was a lot of women who came to the various field hospitals and volunteered their services. And they provided such things as cleanliness, hygiene, TLC. And you know what? The patients benefited from that. Who knew? So after that, it's been hand in glove, working together kind of a relationship. Now, the one more story to tell based on these older circumstances was that without a hospital, people still got sick, people still got surgical disease. And one of my first storytellers here is going to be Ted Sprague, who's from the first row all the way on the right with the arrow, and his father, John Rollins Sprague, J.R. Sprague, in the middle of the front row. So J.R.'s the father, Ted's the younger. Ted wrote a biography of his father's career, and it's from that I'm going to be telling you some of these origin stories. But first of all, before there was a hospital, J.R. Sprague had acute appendicitis cases, and they didn't do well. Why is that? Well, there was nobody to operate on them. And if you put them on the train to Columbus, by the time they got there, they were usually dead. So this is an acute process that needs an acute treatment. So Ted Sprague, his brother Warren, and another doctor went to Harvard University and took a brief course on surgery, including appendicitis and gallbladders and so forth, and came back. And now when their patients developed acute appendicitis, Dr. JR would make a house call on them, call a colleague who provided anesthesia of sorts, and they would put the patient on their own kitchen table, the patient's kitchen table, and operate. And actually did fairly well. Instead of having more than 90% dying, they had about 90% survival. So that's what people were up against before there were hospitals, okay? So the next story from Ted, I'm going to actually read. Beginning in 1921, and there's Ted as an older man, that way most of us remember him. And here's a timeline that we're going to work with. So beginning in 1921, Mrs. Delia Breinig, who had an interest in nursing, and her husband Charles invited women to use rooms in their home at 17 Clark Street on the west side of Athens to deliver their babies. Sometimes a single physician might have women in labor in different towns all at the same time. But if the women were at the same location, the doctors believed they could do a better job in taking care of them. So the doctors began to influence their patients to have their babies on Clark Street, even though most women still wanted to have their babies in their homes. They didn't want to pay the extra $50 it would cost to stay there. So soon after returning to Athens from New York, Dad was called to deliver a baby to a woman who, along with her husband, was occupying a room at the home of the Breinigs. After the delivery, my dad jokingly commented to Mrs. Breinig, "You might as well start a hospital here." Well, the idea appealed to Mrs. Breinig and her husband, a building contractor. Soon, Mrs. Breinig asked Blaine Goldsberry, and I'll be showing you his picture by and by, a new physician in Athens, what he thought of the idea, and he also encouraged the couple to proceed. Starting off with 2 rooms accommodating no more than 5 patients, the facility opened for business in 1921. The name Sheltering Arms was chosen for the new hospital based on a suggestion from Dr. Goldsberry's wife, Virginia, who had done volunteer work at a hospital of the same name in West Virginia. Mr. Breinig repeatedly expanded Sheltering Arms with new additions and improvements, the last of which was a 2-story wing for maternity cases, built in 1939, had a capacity of 66 beds. Dr. Goldsberry installed X-ray equipment. Carl Fry, professor of bacteriology, started a lab. And so that is the origin story. And here are some pictures. The one on the left shows the original Breinig home. And there on this porch is sitting the Breinig's daughter, Mary Virginia. And the first construction is shown on the right side. Now you have the Breinig's house, I believe, is on the left. And on the right was an adjacent house that has a portico and over the door. And what's in between was a wing that he built, Mr. Breinig built, between the two houses. And after that, things kept going. And so later on, well, here's a quotation from James Anastos, interviewed by Joy Miller-Upton. Sheltering Arms grew like Topsy. It was no Taj Mahal. It was always accredited, which is a real tribute to Sheltering Arms. At times, they held it together with baling wire, just waiting for the new hospital to go up. Why pour money into a place that was not going to exist in the future? We'll hear from James Anastos again. He has been a longtime friend of both Sheltering Arms and Oblenus Hospitals and a major fundraiser for both. And here are Delia and Charles Breinig later in life. Mr. Breinig remained a contractor. He built the Armory building at the foot of Court Street in Athens, also built a Ohio University building on President Street called a Science Hall, which has since been torn down. And here was 3 days ago, what it looks like, okay? So with the Breinig house on the left, you see that little bump out between house number 1 and house number 2. And then there's a recess behind that umbrella and that tree. And then it bumps out again into that, I imagine that's a 2-story maternity ward. So it still looks a lot like it did before, but now it's apartments for senior citizens. And if you haven't heard of Sheltering Arms, where it is, here's a Google map, which shows you just a quick hop, skip, and a jump from OhioHealth Oblenus Hospital on the modern map. So it's up on the west side of town, very, very close to West Elementary School. So we heard about Dr. Fry, who was a bacteriologist at Ohio University, and there he is in his laboratory on the left, and a more formal portrait on the right. So he established a bacteriology and blood and urine lab. And then I promised to show you Dr. Goldsberry. I didn't give you this, do some scene setting with this picture, which I'm very glad we have. This is originally in Dr. Sprague Jr.'s, or Ted Sprague's collection. But this is in the late 1950s in front of Mount St. Mary Hospital, which is what became Doctors Hospital in Nelsonville. And it was virtually all of the physicians in the whole county, those that practiced almost anywhere, including the doctors from the state hospital. The third from, well, 2 over from Ted Sprague is Dr. Faulkner, who was then the superintendent of Athens State Hospital. And between Dr. Faulkner and Ted is Beatrice Postal Faulkner, who was one of the first female physicians. So anyhow, there's Blaine Goldsberry at the right end of the second row, and there's an arrow pointing to him. And he installed X-ray equipment. Charlie Fulks was born the year that Sheltering Arms started, so he was a little bit of a later comer, but he was the main lab tech and ran the laboratory tests, ran the pregnancy tests. And there's an interesting story about starting X-ray running. So Charlie said, I also took all the X-rays. That was an interesting sidelight. Blaine Goldsberry came down one day and asked me, how would you like to take care of running and taking the X-rays? I said, I'd never taken an X-ray in my life. Goldsberry said, you had anatomy, didn't you? I said, yes. You've had physics, haven't you? Yes. That's all you need to know, he said. You've been around here long enough. You've got some pretty good common sense. And that was his indoctrination to X-rays. And he goes on to say, and that's when you had to calculate everything. There wasn't already things weren't already preset. Everything was calculated. I made charts of how many ampere seconds were needed to take a proper X-ray and deliver the correct amount of radiation, and eventually became a licensed X-ray technician. But there were also some interesting times because there's no maximum cutoff on the machines, no safety feature. So today you can only expose someone with a certain amount of radiation before the machine shuts off. Not then. Around that same line, Clarence Sanders, MD, we called him Skeet, would come over and he'd run the fluoroscope involving long periods of X-ray exposure on everything. That was before people were really aware of the seriousness of radiation. His hands and fingers were burned so badly, they were bloody all the time. While they didn't quite fall off, his hands never healed. And he went on to say that most of the other folks were lax too, wanted them to keep turning up the power, and basically something OSHA would now never stand for, okay? Here's some scenes within humble Sheltering Arms Hospital, taken from a brochure. So you see an operating table, an autoclave to sterilize instruments, and a waiting room. And here's a very dark, very poor picture. There was no elevator. So you had to move your patients up and down stairs to get them from one place to another. And so here's a new mother and her baby coming down the stairs. And it's very, very dark there. And some of that's a problem with the photograph, but I think it was really very dark there too. All right, some other players that coming along here is Theron Harvard, also known as T.H. Morgan. You notice how people are use initials and nicknames all the time? J.R. Sprague, T.H. Morgan. I think it was a thing back then. You didn't use proper names. I had the dickens of time getting people's right names. But anyhow, so here's T.H. Morgan from Ancestry.com, and a second one also from Ancestry.com, labeled Pink and the Dog Fritz. Apparently, Dr. Morgan's nickname was Pink or Pinky. I don't know how he got it. He did. His middle name is Harvard. Harvard uses red. I don't know. Like red wine. I don't know. But he's a very well skilled and trained surgeon who came to Sheltering Arms. And in fact, a portrait of him still hangs from a wall in O'Bleness Hospital as of about 2 days ago, image courtesy of Keely Stockwell. Now, here is an image from 75 years of healthcare in Athens, created largely by Joy and Miller Upton and published as a special issue in 1996 to commemorate the 75th year. So that was 25 years ago. And another player here is Helen Ledford. She was a registered nurse. She's on the left, very modest. She was a second lieutenant in the Army Corps during World War II, off in and on surgery on hospital ships. She was in surgery for 14 or 15 hours a day, going on deck for a smoke and seeing Japanese Zeros and American P-51s in dogfights. She was right there, but she didn't talk much about it. And there's another extended quote from James Anastos. She worked on Sundays more than 8 hours. Working a double shift was common. In those days, administering TLC was very, very important. For what they had short in technology, they made up for in TLC. While she worked very, very hard and many hours, was dedicated, she loved it. She nourished on it. She thrived on working hard. It was rewarding to her. In my estimation, says James, she was an unsung heroine. And by the way, that was T.H. Morgan taking off a patient's cast, who's sitting up and watching him do it. Here's another important player, Betty Morgan, who married Dr. Morgan. And she was the hospital administrator of Sheltering Arms from 1947 to 1966, returned for 5 years, and then became a director of volunteers from 71 until her death in 91 at O'Bleness. So we're kind of shifting back and forth in time a little bit. Stay with me. And in fact, as of 2 days ago, her picture was still hanging in the halls of O'Bleness Hospital. And her name here is Betty Gillum Anastos. We'll learn that Dr. Morgan died in 1957 and widowed Betty Morgan, who subsequently married James Anastos. It's a small world. Now, back to this picture thing. Some folks I want to point out in the sort of the middle of the third row, I guess, a short fellow, dark hair, looking down is Dr. Taman Joseph Najm, also known as Tom. And over there is Dr. Bill Allen, William Allen, also looking down. And here's a later picture of Bill Allen, courtesy of Barbara Gaskell. I'm highlighting these folks because I got stories on them, okay? And these stories came from Jenny Riley, who was recently passed. I was trying very hard to get a picture of it. Unfortunately, I was not able, but you've got a little bio right there. And I was going to read some of these stories, but I have time constraints, so I'm going to paraphrase them. In the case of Dr. Najm, who was a surgeon, he was known for throwing his utensils, his tools around the operating suite and just making a mess of things. And so Jenny eventually stood up to him very firmly and said, listen, I can help you, but I'm going to throw things around too if you keep it up that way. And she laughed and said they got along fine after that. Another story pertains to Bill Allen, which I'm going to read. Okay. I can't say enough about Bill Allen. He was a good surgeon and a good person. I used to work for him in his offices in Nelsonville and Athens whenever his office staff were off. I also assisted him in surgery on many occasions. I had worked with a good many surgeons at Holzer and here, and I thought Dr. Allen was one of the best I'd seen. Doc Allen had a foul mouth sometimes. When he first came to town, I was quite young and had not yet met him. At the time, I was doing private duty with the wife of a prominent local man. She'd had a stroke. Of course, they knew Dr. Allen. Suddenly, he came into the room and just started uttering his four-letter words. Suddenly he came into the room, and where I came from, one just didn't do that in front of patients. I said, could I see you outside the room, please? And I proceeded to tell him outside the room what I thought about it. I told him that I didn't want him cussing in front of my patients. Strangely enough, he didn't say anything to me. Several years later, while I was working at Sheltering Arms, I was sitting in the chart room on the first floor. I looked up and there was Dr. Allen. He sat down beside me and I said, you remember me? He said, Jesus Christ, do I remember you? I laughed. We had never had any problems after that. Towards the tail end of our period at Sheltering Arms, I want to quote Bob Main, whose picture I'll show you momentarily in the same 1958 picture in front of Mount St. Mary Hospital. Said, one of the hardest things I was required to do while I was secretary of the staff of Sheltering Arms Hospital was to write a letter to an osteopathic physician and advise him that he could no longer be on the staff of Sheltering Arms Hospital because he was not a medical doctor. I had liked him and thought he practiced good medicine. And there's Bob May, way up there in the upper left-hand corner. Let's move on to the Oblena story. Most of the fundraising and arranging for it was going on in the 1960s. Charles Oblenis was a banker and major donor for sure. Other sources came in, including a matching grant, huge community fundraising efforts, private citizens, organizations, businesses. And when they came up a little bit short, apart from the $750,000 trust that Oblenis created to start with, he kicked in another $250K, bringing the campaign to $1.7 million. And here are members of the fundraising team, the campaign group, Martin Hecht, Musser, and Dwight Rutherford. And here are some key players. Here's Blaine Goldsberry again, whom I showed you in the other picture, who created the x-rays and Sheltering Arms. He signs a $125,000 pledge from the medical staff to build Oblenis Memorial Hospital, or what would become that. And behind him are other physicians, Lester Hamilton, Wolfhard Baumgartel, and Lawrence Goldberg. And they're sitting next to Dr. Goldsberry with the white hair is Dwight Rutherford, Fund Drive chairman. And here we are, all ready for the groundbreaking ceremony. And Mr. O'Blennis is holding the shovel, but it's really a myth that he turned the first shovelful of dirt in the groundbreaking. The real scoop is that it was 3 kids that did it, okay? So there they are, Scott Evans, Tamala Johnston, and Nancy Stacy, and they're the ones who got the job done. Now, construction started. And way out there in the middle of that bare clay is the start of construction of O'Blennis Hospital. You can see the Convo Center on beyond. And is that the river that's running between O'Blennis Hospital and Convo Center? It is, it was. 2 things were happening at once. O'Blennis Hospital was being built, and the river was being moved by the Army Corps of Engineers. So you can see where it still is, and you can see where it's going to go more to the right fork instead of the left fork. So the other thing going on in town at the same time, it was a very exciting year. It was they're building the bypass around town. Kennard Bush of the Messenger was just so excited. All right, so here's the opening of O'Blennis Memorial Hospital. And this comes from the 75th year thing. And that was largely, if not entirely, put together by Joy Miller Upton. And so we can see that Elizabeth O'Blennis was present. Her husband had died the year before, thus the name for Memorial Hospital. And Charles Mullins on the left from the Board of Trustees, Dwight Rutherford on the right. And I think that with that cue, we can identify the same folks in this color photo. I think Mrs. O'Blennis is in that teal colored dress, and that's was it Musser on the left and Rutherford on the right. You know, whoever decided to make the entrance of O'Blennis Hospital face north cursed generations of photographers thereafter. It's the worst lighting you can get, so it's always in a shadow. So just a point of view there. All right, so Lillian K. Bowser Collins also wrote a chapter in the county medical history, and I was going to read from them extensively, but I'm not. One story she told was she worked a little bit at Sheltering Arms, mostly in training, but then moved over to the new O'Blennis, and thought it was very nifty. The thing that she got most excited about is the pneumatic tubes that would go shuffling orders, doctor's orders, and lab specimens and so on from one part of the hospital for another. She just thought that was tremendous. She'd never seen anything like that. Of course, they jammed a lot. And one story that I will read to you is her experience with Dr. Kennard, our general surgeon, both at Sheltering Arms and at O'Blennis. She said, some of the mentors were physicians. Philip Kennard, MD, taught us nurses something every time we made rounds with him. He would talk to a farmer in one bed and a professor in the next bed, and each would feel as if they were the only patient he had to take care of that day. One afternoon, early in my RN years, I was making rounds with him. He was changing a dressing on one of his surgical patients. All of a sudden, he turned to me and said, "Give me a poke." I almost died. There was no way I was going to poke this admired professional. Finally, he laughed and said, "A bag, Lillian. I need a bag. Haven't you ever heard of a poke?" So here's somebody you may know. This is sort of my title slide for Rick Castro, younger and not so young. I'll let him tell his own story via this caption on the upper left hand. So take a moment to read that. So he passed the gray hair test and did so in spades later in his life. So what were some of the things that the first couple administrators had to deal with? James Boyce mostly before Rick, and then starting in 1979, Rick, who went on into the 1990s. 2008 to be exact. Well, they had some financial problems, okay? All that money that was raised, most of the doctors in town were old. The youngest one had come 15 years earlier, and that was Dr. Charles Jividan. They were set in their ways. There weren't very many specialists, and the hospital calculated that there's no way that they would even break even just to service their debt. So Mr. Boyce and Rick knew that things had to be done. They needed to attract new doctors, particularly younger ones, in numbers to generate the patient care that would help pay the bills. It didn't help that Rick came into his office in the middle of a major strike between management and the union that was nasty as well. Another one occurred a little later, but there was a healing process and they got better. From Rick's chapter in the county medical history, there's one paragraph that's one sentence long, which is my favorite. He said, as his first executive act, he removed the cigarette machine from the cafeteria, which was major, okay? It was a different time back then. Patients smoked in their rooms, staff smoked in the meeting rooms. We hope the patients didn't smoke too close to the oxygen lines, but it's a very different place. All right, so you had to get new doctors in. So I've got semi-chronologic pictures to show you. So here's a younger generation family practitioner who came to town, Mark Rothstein, with his wife, Lynn, and he socializes with an older generation family practitioner, Larry Goldberg. And later on, Mark shaved off his beard and attracted a partner, John Ortman, had a joint family practice. Actually, another individual, Larry Dansky, was a partner in between. All right, so here we have Carrie Dean, director of the maternity ward, Phil Kennard, general surgeon, and Betty Hurst, who was director of nursing from 1982 to 1990. I don't have an exact year on this. It was probably roughly late 80s, early 90s. But already we're getting some warm bodies and even some specialists to see the patients. From left to right on the top, we have Dave Brown in the emergency department, Paul Catamignani, internal medicine, Dick Gaskell, pediatrician, Jack Knable, internal medicine, Phil Kennard, general surgeon, John Kroner, OBGYN. Sitting, we have, of course, Rick. Bruce Paxton was an ophthalmologist, and William Carlson, Bill Carlson, was a pediatrician, and there was me, who was a neurologist. So we're starting to get some critical mass here. Let's stop and talk about the radiology situation. The first radiologist and board certified at that was Earl Stanley. By and by, he attracted someone to work with, and that was John Murray. This is much later after that joining together on the occasion of John Murray showing off the region's first fixed, that is, not riding on a truck, magnetic resonance scanning machine. And that was even 8 years after the first CT scan, which happened in 1983, which was good for me because as a neurologist, that's when I came to town and needed one. So good timing on that. I don't think it was about me, though. Here's a well-beloved radiology tech, James Hatton, who's managing the command and control of a more advanced MRI scanner. Now, concerning getting more bodies in the pipeline by way of doctors. I think might be overstating things to say that the osteopaths came and saved the day, but you know what? It's not far off the truth. Due to circumstances not managed by the local community, there came a new osteopathic medical school that opened its doors in 1975. And in the upper left-hand corner, you have their first academic building, and lower right is their newer building. So they started training medical students. Some would stay in the area, but more immediately, many of their faculty members were physicians, and they were all ready to go. Work part-time with clinic and hospital work and part-time teaching. We started to increase the mass of physicians even more. In fact, sorry about this newspaper grade photo, but it's very illustrative in some ways. This is from the fall of 1988. And by then, the number of osteopaths had increased greatly. And I put an X on each one of their chests. That's not a target. It's just to show you how many osteopathic physicians there were in relation to the MDs. And already in this picture, there were more osteopathic physicians staffing the hospital, at least as represented by this picture, than there were medical doctor MDs. Moreover, residency programs started. So osteopathic physicians trained osteopathic recently graduated physicians in a residency training program. This is the family practice program. I think it's still going. This picture was taken around 2005. The faculty members in the picture are Rebecca Houston, Linda Ford, Jean Redos, and Dawn Salmons. Now, with the osteopathic physicians drawing into Athens County, there's another human interest and first story, and that's Dr. Clay Thompson, who turned out to be the first medical school graduate of color to serve in Athens County. And he came to the county in '76 and in Nelsonville, and came to Glennis Memorial Hospital in '79. He's had a distinguished career providing emergency medical care, took over from the Dean Myers, as a radio host of a medical radio show heard far and wide, and also served as director of the Medical School's Center of Excellence in Multicultural Medicine. Has been a real asset to the community. And I'm just going to show you some new collections of physicians that I haven't shown you in part, at least in part yet. Not strictly chronological, but semi-chronological. So here's the core of the biggest and now the only OBGYN group in Athens, with Jack Ramey, Jody Jerome, Kathleen Bertuna, Jane Broker, and Michael Clark. And they're still located in the Castro Center. And by '91, there were so many doctors that you couldn't even take a picture of all of them at once. And I haven't labeled this. Maybe you can look to see if you recognize people there, or maybe you recognize yourself. But this is a panel of 3 pictures. So things are going pretty well by '91. As far as having enough bodies to do some work, there's Larry Dansky in the upper right a little bit that I mentioned previously. And here's the right-hand side. Randy Purdy in front of, behind Dr. Shan. And behind Randy is Peter Dane at the emergency department. So there's a lot of folks. Well, the next chapter is modernizing the hospital. Major push. It was in 1993. I can't say things or picture them any better than Joy Miller Upton, who already did this for the 75-year in healthcare issue of the Athens Messenger. But many things were changed with this $11 million project. The ER, patient registration area, operating rooms, laboratory, gift shop, business offices, medical records, new patient waiting areas, improved traffic so that clinicians are racing to the scene of an emergency don't smash into people who are just sort of wandering through the hallways. Surgical department and radiology department, all larger, improved, much larger footprint of the hospital. And however, the part that I liked the best was the Willow View Cafe. All those things were important and they were great, and they really helped take care of the community much better than before. But I love the Willow View Cafe. It's very picturesque. It's creatively made. It's a comfortable place to eat and enjoy the companies of others. So that came out of the 93 construction too. It's my favorite. Maybe you have your favorite. Soon after that was the Castro Center of all places. Okay, so what was the story here? Well, just after this modernization, really, really needed to have physicians be attracted to the area and stay here and earn a living here. And you have to help the doctors to earn a living to do that, okay? So creating some price reasonable offices that actually the physicians could buy into. It's like buying a condo. And then also the surgical suite. Now this building is just yards away from the main hospital. But that turned out to be important. You could have an ambulatory that is a freestanding surgical suite that the insurance companies would allow their patients to go to and not go to the hospital in some cases where the prices were higher because their overhead was higher. And so right next to each other, you had a situation in which the surgical action was competing against your own surgical action. But you had to do that because all the other hospitals were doing it too. Now, here's sort of the wide view of the Castro Center in the early days. And it's almost the same now, except at the extreme right, you don't see radiation oncology bump out yet. It would be on the extreme right of this. So that was a little bit later addition. And this was the key to it, was Dr. Aaron Williams. I'm sorry, I didn't put him on the caption. His wife, I believe, Cheryl Williams, became the radiation oncologist, and thus O'Bleness's very first linear accelerator for treating cancer patients with radiation therapy. So in the radiation oncology business. Next development is the Cornwells leave the hospital a lot of money. And they were chief donors as in their bequest after their death to what became the Cornwell Center, which housed cardiology and endocrinology services. So here's the recognition that there's going to be a Cornwell Center coming in 2006. Fred Weber and members of the Cornwell family on the left, various doctors, and Rick on the right, including two endocrinologists and Mitch Silver, a cardiologist. Here is the opening of the facility, the dedication of the Cornwell Center. And I really want to point out at the extreme right, a person I've mentioned a couple times already. In this case, you can't miss him because he's got a blue arrow over his head, and that is James Anastos, who has been a major fundraiser over the years, unfortunately has since passed. So kind of an interesting building, this Cornwell Center that was off to the west end of the building, replacing some doctor's offices that used to be there. So this is what it looked like in those days. We had the Cornwell Center from the outside. We have a really wild curved hallway. We have people talking at the back desk, and we have exercise machines. So it's an interesting place. It was then, still is. And then here's Mitch Silver, a cardiologist who got cardiology going in that center, and along with the administration team, and created the first cath lab and did first procedures there. So here is the wonderful new arteriography, our cardiac cath equipment, and you can see the results of his work on the right. That's somebody who's looks like mostly healthy coronary arteries that Dr. Mitchell Silver generated. And nowadays, as of 4 days ago, maybe, this is what the outside of the Cornwall Center looks like. So here's some other folks. Everybody bears mentioning, of course, even though I don't mention everybody, but here's Muthia Shan-McGam, known by everyone, fortunately, as Dr. Shan, because it's easier to say, and Edna Roberts, who was Director of Nursing from 1990 to 2002. And here's key administrative people: Rhonda Hughes, Executive Secretary, Edna Roberts, and Rita Bruce, who was Director of the Admissions Center. Here is Skip Young, an administrator on the left, who looks awfully lonely and left out because he's not getting any loving like Phil Kennard is from Bev Dellinger, who was Director of Nursing starting in 2002. Ron Davis and James Schultz are looking at this hazmat shower, wondering which one of them should take the first demonstration shower. So the hospital is getting kind of big by this time. So you can see the original O'Bleness Hospital, kind of lower left, and the the Cornwall Center stretching on beyond to the west. And now we have this separated slightly building, the Castro Center. And there's going to be some new action occurring in the lower right-hand area, primary practice office. So the latest nursing officer, that is Director of Nursing, is Rhonda Dixon, whom I haven't personally met, but you can see from her credentials, she's qualified in spades, and I'm sure she's doing a marvelous job. And maybe Mark Seckinger can tell us something about her later. Now, here is a quiz. Who is this guy? Who is the guy standing over that chair? Do you look familiar at all? You know him? I can give you some clues. He was born in Sheltering Arms Hospital in '56. In fact, delivered by Philip Woodworth, whom I mentioned earlier. So that's certainly an Athens County bona fide. Graduated Nelsonville York High School, still in Athens County. Earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Industrial Technology from the College of Engineering in Ohio University in '79. You figuring it out? CEO of Doctors Hospital of Nelsonville, '83 to '98. And so if you haven't figured out by now, this is Mark Seckinger. I don't know how many people realize that he already had a star turn in Athens County before he came to O'Bleness, but he was well respected, very accomplished. I'll just share my own reminiscences. First two mental images I have in mind from about Mark Seckinger is one, back in the 1980s when I went to the hospital up there to see a neurology consult case. And there he was out with the maintenance crew, puffing on a cigar, hanging out. And I later learned that from his successor, Joel Kaiser, that Mark was never afraid to swing a hammer or twist a wrench. And in fact, perhaps his background in industrial technology had something to do with that. I don't know. Maybe he'll tell us. So now, the first one, he does not pass the gray hair test, but now he does. In fact, I think his haircut looks a little bit like Mark Harmon, who plays Gibbs in NCIS, right? Like a Marine haircut or something. I don't know. But anyway, sorry about that. So just in time to give a presentation on Mark, we understand that he's soon to retire, and recent announcements that say that Mark did a lot of things while he was here for 5 years. And so what exactly was that? Revised the cancer center, new staff, new services, a new accelerator, a new state-of-the-art ICU, construction of the OhioHealth Nelsonville Health Center. So not O'Bleness, but in Athens County, part of the OhioHealth Services, a major expansion of the emergency department, new physician group, transition to a new electronic health record system that I know the physicians and nurses just love to do that. The construction of 30,000 square foot medical office building on the hospital grounds, that is the primary care building, and recruitment of key specialists, including the recent hiring of 2 board certified pulmonologists, the first of which I'm happy to say cured my daughter with pneumonia, did a great job for her. And so let's see, do we believe this stuff? Okay, there's a new radiation machine, new linear accelerator, check. This is where it's kept. The Castro Health Centers is the main part, but the side entrance has been, since Aaron Williams was there, the entrance for the cancer patients, separate from the main entrance. And that part that you barely see off to the right is cloaked in lead wires, and that's where you put all walls, lead walls, that keeps radiation in and keeps the rest of us safe. Upgraded ICU unit suites, check. I understand it arrived just in time for COVID, which we're all appreciative of. And here's what the OhioHealth Nelsonville Health Center and Urgent Care Center, offices of various kinds, as of Monday looked like. And here is the new private practice, primary practitioner building under construction. And there's a fancier picture of how it's looking once completed. And part of this was merging many primary care doctors that had been elsewhere in town, including the Castro Center, as well as those that previously worked for Ohio University, and they're all together now. And on the upper floor is even some physicians in training. Now, I don't know where to stick this, but interestingly, back to back with this new primary care construction building, primary care building, is the Urgent Care Center and a pain clinic. The lots are adjacent. You can walk from one to the other, out of the back of one building into the other. Can't drive there. They didn't create one of those, but it's really sort of kind of the same campus. Now, this building started off as the offices for Dr. Atmaram and Sushila Gawande. So let's give them their due. Here's Sushi Gawande, pediatrician, and Ram Gawande, urologist. And finally, let me say hi to some community relations professionals. I haven't met them all, but Joy Miller-Upton and Lynn Anastos have helped me tremendously in this final stretch, and I thank them. And that's what I have. So we have some experts in residence here. Mr. Rick Castro, who is a longtime CEO, now retired. And we also have Mark Seconder, the current president of OhioHealth Blaine Hospital, who will soon retire. So first of all, Rick and Mark, do you have any just initial reflections that you wanted to make before we open things to questions?
Dr. Cordingley, I actually had a couple questions for Mark and Rick, sort of helping them reflect. And I'll start with Mark. So Mark, you've been at O'Bleness for 6 years, and growing up here and spending a lot of time here, you knew the community really well. You knew O'Bleness and the medical community. I'm interested in what your impressions were those first days 6 years ago when you became president.
Well, thanks, Sid. Well, one of the first things I really reflected on is how many former presidents had been in there since Rick left. We had 8 permanent and temporary presidents during that time. And that left a lot of associates. Who's the new president? What's going on? And I think one of the things, and it's kind of, that being a hometown boy, I grew up in Nelsonville, born in Athens, went to Ohio University, lived in Athens, lived in the Plains. My mom and dad were from Jacksonville, Trimble. This was home to me. And I think you could feel that people, all the associates wanted that. You know, that Rick was president for many, many years, and they had a stability there. And Rick did a nice job with the people. And to have 8 people during the span of 9 years or so, that was a problem. And I knew if we could just get together and form this team, we could do great things. And I can't look back and say over the 6 years, Sid, could have got so not much more done. I mean, we got a lot of things done, and it's the community, and we went through a pandemic, but I knew we could do it. And I feel so blessed to be working as the president and retiring from OhioHealth of Glennis.
So, thank you, Mark. Rick, I'm going to sort of ask you the same question. After seeing the presentation and sort of getting a walk down memory lane, can you reflect a little bit about what you have seen happen, not personally over 50 years, but how the hospital has changed and the impression that you're left with?
Well, thanks for the question. I learned some things watching this presentation that I did not know. So I was paying real close attention to what Gary was saying. And the first thought that comes to my mind, it's humbling to be, a part of this 100-year process from what started out to be to what it is now. And you're given a trust when you're given a responsibility like this, and you just hope that you can handle your trust, wisely and beneficially. So we did some very nice things during the time I was there. They always have to be understood in the context of the time that they were done and the decisions that were made at the time. But the local physicians that I've dealt with through the years, the physicians that came with the medical school, it was a very interesting and dynamic time for us. We had excellent board members, accomplished a lot of projects, stabilized a lot of things. And one of our verbally expressed goals in the years prior to 2008 when I left was, the big question was, can Oblenos Hospital survive as a sole isolated community hospital? And our best answer was maybe, but probably not. Let's try to get ourselves in a position where an OhioHealth, an Ohio State, or Mount Carmel, or somebody might find us attractive enough to want to partner with. So that was kind of a driving strategy of a lot of our decisions. And it ended up working out. And when I left, I didn't know till Mark just told me, it took 8 people before they got to you. That's a hoot. I'd say I'm a tough act to follow, but they finally got the right guy. Seriously, I remember being at home, hearing that OhioHealth got involved. I wasn't part of that decision. I was long gone. And then when you got this job, I said, people are going to love him. I really did. And it worked out. You relate so well to the people, and I'm really, really happy with the things that OhioHealth and you have done to Oblenos. You built on a lot of the successes we had and made things even better. Corrected probably a few mistakes that we made, but that's part of the process. So really proud of having played a small role in a 100-year history here. And this was very instructive, informative, and helpful, and very gratifying to see it laid out. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. You did a lot of great things, and I appreciate your comments, because I too learned a lot. And I want to thank Dr. Cordingley, because this was really special, and Tom also for helping out with this.
Yeah.
So we have a couple questions in the chat, and this is actually a super appropriate question from Alex. She was wondering Dr. Cordingley's thoughts as to why it is important that we understand and study local medicine history.
Well, I think that's a softball question because I think she asked me the same question a day or two ago, but I appreciate it, and it is a good question. I think that the micro and the macro, that is zooming in and zooming out, is just so intriguingly entrained that a lot of these stories are like stories that a lot of other places have had. But we have our own special characters, okay? And some of them, as Rick said, I think really were characters, or maybe he said that before the formal broadcast. But we've got some great stories, and we've had some things shaping our county's medical history differently than some other counties, including in southeastern Ohio, including anywhere. We had the Athens State Hospital start in 1874. They were the first hospital in Athens County by a long shot. And did they take in patients for general medical care? No, but they provided those services to their psychiatric inpatients. And in fact, pulled in a fair number of surrounding physicians like JR and Ted Sprague, for example. And then we have the university's influence, and that has been special. We've had a sharing of, quite frankly, that's why the group of osteopaths came in the 1970s, 1980s. They were drawn by the osteopathic medical school, both to teach there and to learn there. And many of them stayed on and became members of the local medical community. Some of them stayed in the area and became competitors of O'Bleness, but that's fine too. So a lot of factors going on. Penicillin came the same year, no matter where you are. So everybody has kind of similar penicillin history or whatever else. Everybody had to do with diagnostic related groups at the same time, so everybody has that kind of same story. But we have our special characters and our special flavors. And I think that it's just interesting in its own way. And if you want to learn the history of macro medicine, it's a great place to start is the micro, zooming in before you zoom out, or as you zoom out.
Great. Thank you. We don't have a lot of other questions, but we do have a lot of kudos to you in the chat to thank you, and people are enjoying the presentation, so thank you. I guess if anybody has any other questions, please, you can put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to turn this back over to Tom.
Thank you. I'm one of those people from the community. Since healthcare is not my business, I'm like many people, I don't even think about it till I need it. And we take it for granted. And to add on to what Dr. Cordingley said about what's the importance of learning about it, I guess it goes along with many things. The more we learn about anything, the more important it becomes to us. In my business, history, the more we learn about an old building, the more important it becomes. If it's just an old building or a person or an event or a place, the more we learn about it, the more important it is. And so I learned a lot tonight too, as everyone else seems to have. And now I'm a lot more interested, and I'm going to end up learning more as we go down the road. So thank you for that presentation tonight. So thanks to Sydney and Keeley and Dr. Cordingley and Mark and Rich. And it takes a big team to pull something like this together. Thanks for being here tonight. And thanks for all the OhioHealth folks for this wonderful collaboration. And thank you all for joining. Before we go, I need to mention that we have Dr. Cordingley's book, Stories of Medicine in Athens County, Ohio, available for purchase at the museum store at the History Center. And it should soon be available here at O'Bleness at the gift shop as well. And it's a wonderful story, as you heard tonight. It's full of a lot of firsthand stories and accounts of people who lived through these events and changes that have been grand, as we can see. So if you'd like to learn more about Oblenis or the History Center, get a hold of these two organizations. Programming like this, you can find us at the History Center online with Facebook or at athenshistory.org. So thank you all for tonight's program. I learned a lot.